the Brain Simulator 2, the Universal Knowledge Store. This video introduces a major step forward in the development of the Brain Simulator 2, with new modules which implement a universal knowledge store and two types of learning, neither of which use backpropagation. With all I'd like to share, this video will be split into multiple parts. Recall that the Brain Simulator 2 is an experimental project which combines a spiking neuron model with modules which contain any desired software. Neither a product nor an application toolkit, the Brain Simulator is changing rapidly, so this video is just a snapshot of the current state of development in January of 2020. The Brain Simulator 2 has been in development for about a year and is currently available as a free download at http://brainsim.org. It will soon be available on GitHub. Your input and suggestions are always welcome, and I encourage you to download and participate in this free open source project. In previous development, I created a general knowledge graph using the Brain Simulator spiking neuron model, which is described more fully in this video. Computer, what is red?
Red is a color.
Key conclusions from that development are that one can create a graph structure of virtually any complexity using only spiking neurons and synapses. To build a graph which has a single relationship, think parent-child, requires a minimum of 6 neurons per node, and additional types of relationships can be added to any node with additional neurons. For this development iteration, I have moved lots of the neuron synapse computation into code to make it easier to experiment with various ideas and structures. Here are my objectives for the Universal Knowledge Store. Biological plausibility. The ability to store any kind of knowledge and relationships, to have little pre-programming with both the structure and the content being learned, and the knowledge store to contain internal learning capabilities. Biological plausibility is not an absolute necessity, but as the human brain is the only working intelligence we know of, it seems like a logical place to start. I'll assume that you are familiar with the general idea of a knowledge graph, which represents information as a collection of nodes connected by edges. For example, in a semantic network, which is a type of knowledge graph, nodes usually represent words and connections represent various linguistic relationships. Where does the Universal Knowledge Store fit into my overall structure for AGI? Any intelligent entity accepts inputs from various senses and outputs actions, which might be words or physical movements. The Universal Knowledge Store remembers and provides information for planning and modeling in order for the entities to select the best action in any given situation. The entity might be a robot or an organism, but for repeatable test situations, I have replaced the world with a world simulator. While this would technically be external to the Brain Simulator, it was easiest to write as a module within. The simulator takes as inputs words and physical motions directed by the digital entity, and generates simulated vision, touch, phrases, and other inputs to the entity. I have written a visual display to show how the entity exists and interacts within its world, with arcs showing what her eyes can see. For convenience, I call my digital entity Sally. Right now she has limited abilities, but the components are now in place for limitless expansion. So what's inside the Universal Knowledge Store? The module contains only 2 useful object types: a thing and a link. The thing represents anything, a word, a physical object, an action, etc. And a link connects one thing to another. In a biological system, a thing would contain no content. a thing's meaning would be derived entirely from other things it links to. As you'll see, I've taken some liberties with this constraint. We can say that a link is owned by a thing and connects to another thing in the same way we might say that a synapse is owned by one neuron and connects to another. To get more specific, let's look at some code. While this is written in C#, the concepts are not specific to this language and could be implemented in virtually any object-oriented procedural language. I'll endeavor to explain the code in a way that anyone with programming experience can understand. First, because it's simpler, we'll start with the definition for a link. Each link is owned by a thing, so one end of the link is implied. The other end of the link is the target thing T. The connection is from the owner thing to the target T, and each link has a weight. You can see that a link is analogous to a synapse in that it connects from one neuron to another in a single direction, and it has a weight or strength. There is a bit more to the link, which I'll cover later when I describe learning. Now for the thing. First off, we might wish to implement a tree-like structure of things, so there is the ability to create parent-child relationships. By using a C# list structure, each thing can have any number of parents and any number of children. This way we can produce unlimited ISA relationships. These relationships don't have any weights. They simply exist or they don't. More on this later too. The knowledge store might look like this with the parent-child connections shown. From this we could say that a circle is a shape and a shape is a thing. Before continuing with the structure of a thing, understand that the universal knowledge store is essentially just a list of things. Things which contain links to other things within the knowledge store. The list of links named references give a thing the ability to reference any number of attribute things. A physical object might represent things representing color, texture, shape, size, location, etc., but it also may represent things which are words and phrases. Here I have added attributes to 3 physical objects. Obj1 is a blue square, 2 is a green square, and 3 is a green circle. Note that the object things themselves need not contain any actual information. The information is embedded in the connections. The fact that the thing labeled Obj1 is a physical object, which is a blue square, can be completely deduced from the parent and reference information. The references are mirrored with the referenced by list, so Sally can easily determine not only what color a thing is by following the references to a child of the color thing, but also what other things have the same color by subsequently following the colors referenced by list. I should point out that this type of back reference is a great convenience for software development, but cannot be implemented with the biological synapses of a single neuron. It would require multiple neurons and multiple synapses for a brain to function equivalently. Reference lists can be ordered or unordered. As an example, the attributes of a physical object all exist simultaneously, so are unordered. On the other hand, the words of a phrase must occur in particular order, or the meaning may be lost. Here, P1 has ordered references and outputs the phrase correctly. P2 represents a physical object with attributes, so it makes sense that the list of references evaluates all references simultaneously. For illustration, P3 has unordered references to words, and this obviously makes no sense as all words would happen at once rather than forming a meaningful phrase. The next two properties in each thing are a great programming convenience. By giving each object an optional label, when you look at debug information about the content of the knowledge store, it can make sense. Of course, biological neurons don't have labels, which is one reason it's so difficult to decode what's going on inside your brain. Then there is a value, which can be any data type. I've used this to store an item needed to make the program run before other areas of the program have been developed. For example, I use this to store color information. Rather than deciding today how Sally might represent color information, I simply stash the raw RGB levels into the value and can defer this question of the internal representation of color for a future development iteration. The key to these two properties, the label and the value, is that if I write software which relies on them, I know that I'm cutting corners on the biological plausibility front. This may mean that I need to rethink the algorithm down the road, or that conversely, I've implemented a mechanism which can give Sally an efficiency edge over her biological counterparts. Next, each thing has a use count, which keeps track of how often a thing has been accessed. And finally, the current reference variable keeps track of ordered references. To speak a phrase, the words need to be output sequentially over many cycles, and this variable was necessary to implement this ability. While developing the knowledge store software, I really needed a display for examining the content of the knowledge store. With this, you can expand lists of children and references, and each thing's label is shown, followed by the use count. When auto refresh is enabled, you can see the use count values increasing for each color Sally sees. The color things labeled C0 through C4 also use the value shown after each use count to store the hex RGB of the color. So far, I've described a somewhat abstract data structure. How does this connect to the spiking neural model of the rest of the brain simulator? Well, here you can see neurons representing color things labeled C0 firing in the knowledge store as Sally sees various colors as she turns. I initially implemented a module with a single neuron for each thing in the knowledge store, but ran into difficulties, so I expanded to 2 neurons for each thing, representing the input or output of each thing. So signals arriving from other parts of the brain are connected to the input, and signals going from the knowledge store to other parts of the brain are connected to the output. That's all I have time for in this video. In subsequent videos, I'll cover the actual knowledge structure I'm using and the algorithms I've implemented for learning. I hope you'll subscribe to be notified when the next videos become available, and go to http://brainsim.org to try out this software for yourself. If you found this information interesting, please share this video with your friends and colleagues. Thanks for watching. For more on this timely topic, read my new book, Will Computers Revolt? Preparing for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. Available now at Amazon and book retailers worldwide in paperback, hardcover, and ebook editions.